Good evening. Do I have a microphone? I do. Okay. I'm Michael Brown, President of School for Advanced Research, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this first Creative Thought Forum event of 2023. The title is Women of the Lost Territory, New Mexico, Women of the Past, Present, and Future, featuring Flannery Burke and Vanessa Fonseca-Chávez. Tonight's presentation features a conversation between these two experts, both of whom call New Mexico their home state. They'll discuss influential women in New Mexico history, addressing some of the best known examples and how their stories help us to uncover those of lesser known women whose histories have been lost in the state's complex history. Before I turn over the floor to our two distinguished speakers who will be engaging in a conversation, so it'll be a lot of fun, and we will have Q&A at the end too. We'll allow for that, which will be great. They will introduce themselves at their request, but my job is to thank our generous sponsors. They include the Pelham Foundation, Adobo Catering, the Flora Crichton Lecture Fund, the Luke and Betty Vortman Endowment Fund, members of SAR's Founder Society, Newman's Own Foundation, Thornburg Investment Management, and Santa Fe Dining. I also want to recognize members of our board of directors, many of whom are here tonight. Thank you very much for all that you do for SAR, and we really appreciate your continued commitment and support. If you'd like to become a member of SAR, or if you'd like to become a board member of SAR, you can go to our website and find out how to become a member. You can grab a staff member on your way out, and they will point you in the right direction. They will also give you one of these. This is our schedule for the next few months, and it includes events like the Henry Louis Gates Jr. talk with Andrew Curran on April 13th, which will be at the Lensic Performing Arts Center, and we hope to see 800 people there. So you'll hear more about that as we get closer to the date. Friendly reminder, just remember to mute your cell phones or other electronic devices, and join me in giving a good Santa Fe bienvenido to Flannery and Vanessa.
Hello, good evening, everyone. How are you? Good. It's so good to see so many of you here. The room is almost full. How exciting. So we're going to begin tonight. I'm going to give an introduction of Flannery, and she'll introduce me, and then we'll get started. So Flannery Burke, who's from Santa Fe, is an associate professor of history at St. Louis University. She's the author of two books, the first being Greenwich to Taos, Primitivism and Place at Mabel Dodge Luhan with the University Press of Kansas. And her second book is A Land Apart, The Southwest and the Nation in the 20th Century, published with the University of Arizona Press. Her current book focuses on how Westerners imagined the Eastern United States in the 20th century, which should be very exciting because it kind of flips the script on that conversation.
And Vanessa Fonseca-Chávez is Associate Professor of English and Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Arizona State University. In 2020, she published Colonial Legacies in Chicano Literature and Culture, Looking Through the Kaleidoscope, as well as Querencia, Reflections on the New Mexico Homeland, an edited collection, which was named a finalist for an International Latino Book Award. She co-directs the Following the Manito Trail project, which is currently on display at Los Luceros, so you all have weekend plans. Later this year, her co-edited collection, The Literary Life and Work of Margarita Cota Cardenas, will be published by University of Arizona Press. Her current book project is entitled From Where We Stand, Placemaking and Belonging in the Arizona and New Mexico Borderlands. Vanessa and I wanted to pay homage to some of the people who brought us to the spot that we're sitting in today. A very short list will be in the images that I hope we'll show behind us shortly. I think there are over 60 slides, and we're well aware of the fact that this is an incomplete list of the women who have influenced us. I also wanted to give a special shout out to 5 women, Marnie Sandweiss and Gingy Scharf, who I believe recommended me and Vanessa to Michael Brown. So thank you, Michael, for listening. Thank you, Mary Madigan, for listening. Thank you, SAR, for listening to Marnie and to Gingy. I also want to thank my mom, of course. I'm pretty sure that a good portion of the networking that led to visitors here on my behalf is my mom's doing. And then I'd finally like to thank my Aunt Helen, who, in addition to being a fabulous journalist and editor, raised a marvelous daughter named Marin Woods, who for Christmas this year gave me Rebecca Bloom Martinez's book, her co-edited collection, The Shoulders We Stand On. So all of the women that you will be seeing here in the images, all of the women that I just named, these are the shoulders I stand on.
And I'd like to take just a moment to thank 4 women, one of which, in Chicano literature, it's very common to hear about the archetypes of the mother and the grandmother and their role within Chicano literature and culture. So of course, I need to start with my mother, Vivian Fonseca, who is not in the audience, and she likely would have been calling everybody she knew to attend had she been in the States. She is vacationing in Hawaii right now, so I'm very excited for her. And then my grandmother, Gertrudis Chavez Ponce, who is from Western New Mexico and is my lineage here in New Mexico dating back many years, like many folks in the audience. I also want to give a shout out to Maria Dolores Gonzalez, who was my first professor, Novo Mexicana, that I met when I started my master's degree at the University of New Mexico in Hispanic Southwest Studies. There I began to recover my heritage language and to learn more about Nuevo Mexicano culture. And then, of course, Diana Rebolledo, who is a very well-known Chicana scholar. And she always encouraged me to read authors from New Mexico like Cleofas Jaramillo, like Fabiola Cabeza de Vaca, whose images are part of our slideshow for today.
So Vanessa and I titled this talk Women of the Lost Territory because we are both major fans of Kali Fajardo-Einstein, who has written 2 books, one a collection of short stories called Sabrina and Karina, and the other a novel called Woman of Light. And in the stories that are told in Sabrina and Karina, most are about women in Denver who have roots somewhere in northern New Mexico. Kali Fajardo-Einstein herself is of Picaris Pueblo, Hispano, and Filipino descent. And in Woman of Light, the novel, Fajardo-Einstein refers to northern New Mexico as the lost territory. So I thought of Vanessa because she is also a Kali Fajardo-Einstein fan when I thought of the lost territory, but I also thought of Vanessa because Vanessa has really called me to task for giving too much attention to northern New Mexico at the expense of other parts of New Mexico. And so I thought there's another lost territory here, which is the western New Mexico and eastern New Mexico and southern New Mexico, which almost never get scholarly attention. So that is sort of the origin of the lost territory meme, as Michael calls it. It started as a meme just between me and Vanessa, but we hope soon it will be widespread. I'm hoping, Vanessa, that you could talk a little bit about how you got to know Kali Fajardo-Einstein and how you think of the lost territory.
Yeah, so I'll start by saying when I first started as an academic, I was at the University of Wyoming, and I was there for 3 years from 2013 to 2016, and one of the things that fascinated me was finding so many New Mexican women in Wyoming, and I wondered how they got there, what their stories were, and I always share the story of running into this woman at the Ace Hardware store who looked like she could be my tia. She had salt and pepper hair, and I asked her where she was from, and she said Laramie, but the more I talked to her, she revealed that she was from Mora. And so I learned over time of the many, many New Mexicans who migrated from Wyoming, or from New Mexico rather, to the state of Wyoming to work as primarily as sheep herders, and then agricultural workers in the betabel, or the beet fields, and then also in the railroads. And so there was a project that I initiated called Following the Manito Trail, which I co-direct with Levi Romero and one of our scholars in the room, Patricia Perea and Trisha Martinez. And we started looking at the migration paths. This led me to have a conversation with Kali Fajardo-Einstein, who reached out to me over email as she was researching. She had just finished her MFA at the University of Wyoming. I think we missed each other by a year, which is kind of a bummer. But she was working on Woman of Light, and she wanted to know more about the migratory paths of New Mexicans who had made their way through Colorado up to Wyoming and then to other western states. And so Lo and behold, years later, I see Sabrina and Corina, and it's such a great series of stories about women and resilience. The stories are dated back to the 50s and 60s, and so it deals a lot with the discrimination that women faced, New Mexican women primarily living in Denver, and what they faced in the 50s and 60s. It talks about relationships and gentrification. It's a lovely series of short stories. And the one thing that I think is important about it is that when New Mexican women started writing, and we think about Cleofas Jaramillo and Fabiola Cabeza Vaca, for example, they were not nationally known writers. And in many ways, they started writing because their stories were not being told. And so they were writing against Easterners' perspectives of the Southwest. And so they thought that's not right, and we're going to start writing for ourselves. And so they did, but they never reached the kind of national prominence like Kali Fajardo has had. Her books are national bestsellers. They've won multiple awards. And so it's a particular point of pride to think about a New Mexican woman reaching that kind of status as a writer. And I think the only other thing I want to mention about this is in this Manito Trail project, what was interesting is not a lot of people resonated with the word Manito at first. I think it's a common word used in northern New Mexico. And we gave a presentation at one point, and Cordela Candelaria, who's also from New Mexico, she stands up and she said, "Y las manitas?" And we kind of stopped and we all looked at each other. And there's a lot of conversations now in academia about the gendered usage of Spanish. So if it ends in an O, it refers generally to a masculine ending. If it's an A, it's a feminine ending. And so her very pointed question about manita was, what about the women? And so that's really prompted us to think a lot more about what were the women's stories, the women who stayed behind in New Mexico while the men were migrating out to work. A lot of women eventually joined their husbands, but they did so following them. And so we were always interested in what about the lives of these women who stayed behind and kept their families in order, kept the land intact, were here physically to maintain home while their husbands left. And so I think that's a really important story to tell, and it's not a story that we often hear when we're thinking about migration.
Absolutely. And those stories are what underlay the short stories in Sabrina and Corina.
Absolutely, yeah. So if you have not read Sabrina and Corina or picked up a copy of Women of Light, please do so. So I want to move us on because when we were initially talking about this conversation, it was framed around usual suspects. And you and I both kind of thought about that a little more deeply. When you all think about usual suspects of New Mexican women, you might conjure up Georgia O'Keeffe's name, you might conjure up Maria Martinez's name, or you might even conjure up Otero-Warren, who is now on a quarter. It's very exciting. And Anna Nogar, who is from Los Alamos, New Mexico, writes extensively about Otero-Warren and her political history within New Mexico, which is very well known. You also have a book on Mabel Dodge Luhan, which is also another usual suspect. And so I'm wondering if there are any other usual suspects that you might want to conjure up. Who might those be and why?
So first on my list these days is Maria Rosa Villalpando. If any of you are El Palacio readers, you might be familiar with her story. In the 1780s, she was captured by Comanche raiders in Ranchos de Taos. She was separated from her infant son. She was traded to Pawnee and then probably purchased by a Frenchman who took her back to St. Louis. Sometime in the 1790s, the Frenchman went back to France, possibly to his real family, and never returned to St. Louis again. And he had a pretty extensive fur trading empire, and so Maria Rosa Villalpando became a very wealthy woman. 1802, before Lewis and Clark had left St. Louis, before the Santa Fe Trail, before the railroad, certainly before cell phones, guess who shows up in St. Louis? It's her son from Ranchos de Taos. He had learned through the vast network of connections that existed between St. Louis and Taos that his mother had become a very rich woman. So I absolutely adore the story of Maria Rosa Villalpando. but I have apprehension about using it because when I use it in the classroom, when I'm teaching, when I use it in public history venues, Maria Rosa Villalpando's house was right where the south foot of the arch sits now. So if I'm, giving any kind of tour of historical St. Louis, that's a great thing to point out. So I'd love telling the story, but there's a way in which I am using Villalpando to stand for all of the nameless indigenous women who were far more likely to be the victims of that traffic in women that happened in the 1780s, 1790s, and the beginning of the 19th century. So that's one of the qualms I have about usual suspects. When you use a great story and a unique person to stand for a whole, there are other unique stories, other experiences that are flattened.
And I think that's a really important point because part of the scholarship that I do is also situated around what are we to do with monuments. And there have been lively discussions around northern New Mexico about statues and what to do with them. And this all took place, it takes place often, but more so in the past couple of years with the Oñate statues and the obelisk and whatnot. And so the question I almost always get asked is, if not them, then who? And I always say, the women. Nobody is uplifting the women. Nobody is making statues of them. But the other part of it too, and I saw this great film, and I'm going to point out Matthew Martinez in the audience for introducing me to it, but it's called 1,000 Voices. And the premise of the documentary, if you have not seen it through Silver Bullet Films, is that it takes 1,000 voices to tell a story. And so the idea that you would have one statue or one monument tell a story that there's really more voices needs to be recognized. And so the film is about 1,000 indigenous women's voices and what it means for indigenous women, particularly in New Mexico, to tell a story about who they are, where they're from, and what their culture is about, and how they have practiced this kind of resistance and survivance over time. So it's a really powerful story. And so I'm always advocating for all the women. And this was a conversation we had, and I did not know this, but you mentioned that there are historical markers dedicated to women writ large, and there are 51 in the state of New Mexico.
Yes, and there are a couple included in our slides, two of which are dedicated to groups of women, curanderas and the Oya Maidens of Zuni Pueblo. So not every marker marks a specific woman.
Mm-hmm. And one of the other things, we started off with this conversation by talking about Georgia O'Keeffe and our early ruminations on what this conversation might be. And many of you might know that where Georgia O'Keeffe was, near Abiquiu, is known as Georgia O'Keeffe country to many. And I think for a lot of folks, especially indigenous and Hispanic folks who have long-rooted ties to northern New Mexico, that's a little bit problematic to think that there are, again, this idea of Easterners moving into the Southwest and then regions being more popularly recognized by those kind of monikers. And so our hope, my hope certainly as an academic, is to uncover the stories of women who are lesser known. Right now, I really love the story of Refugio Barth de la Navaso, who was from western New Mexico. Her family lived near Magdalena and Atarque, New Mexico, and they were a sheep herding family, much like many sheep herding families in western New Mexico. And Refugio got married to a gentleman named Saul Barth, who is purportedly the founder of St. John's, Arizona. There were lots of ties between western New Mexico and eastern Arizona in the late 1800s as all these towns began to come to life. And so he shows up in Magdalena, New Mexico, and asks to marry Refugio Landavaso. And her family gives him 4,000 head of sheep as a dowry. She's a Catholic woman from New Mexico, the territory at the time, and they move to St. John's, and they have this huge life in St. John's. He's a very shady man, and there's a lot written about his very interesting endeavors. But what's interesting is the information that you find about her is, trips she took to Santa Fe or trips she took to Albuquerque. She shows up often in the newspapers about these kind of ventures that she takes, but she had many children, and those many children had such a long-lasting legacy in eastern Arizona. And that all started with one Catholic Hispanic woman from western New Mexico whose family was able to give a dowry to a gentleman to be able to build this kind of sheep herding empire that existed in eastern Arizona. So I'm interested in those stories. They're hard to uncover sometimes. So I'd love to know a little bit more about your kind of ventures in uncovering the stories about women.
Oh, that's a great question, Vanessa.
We didn't prep that.
No. It reminds me a little bit of when we were preparing and Mary asked, how do you choose a usual suspect? And I remember that your answer was fantastic, which was, my memory of your answer is that we are always lifting as we climb. So as we ourselves, as women academics, try to advance in the field, we are reaching behind us to help the next generation of women scholars succeed. So your answer was awesome. My answer, though, is what I do when I am trying to uncover a usual suspect, I suppose, or any kind of suspect, which is the training that I received at Bryn Mawr College from Sharon Ullman, my advisor, and at the University of Wisconsin-Madison from Linda Gordon, who's written a great book called The Great Arizona Orphan Abduction, if you have not encountered that before, and Jean Boydston, who was also a fantastic women's historian. All of them trained me to look at gender, to put it in academic terms, as a social construction. So there were times when a woman like myself with short hair would have been considered less womanly. There were times when women who owned extensive property were, by virtue of certain cultural systems, considered less womanly. There were times when advocating in the political sphere was considered less womanly. So anytime I see a moment where an individual story can help show how gender is being understood in culture, in a historical moment, that's when I choose that person.
Oh, that's excellent.
Yeah.
I was just recalling, so I met at Arizona State University, and there is a archivist there. Her name is Christine Marin. She's fantastic. And I've been in conversation with her over the years as I've delved into the archives more on the history of eastern Arizona and western New Mexico. And one day she tells me, she goes, "You're one of those New Mexican women, aren't you?" And I knew it was kind of a loaded comment, and I wanted to know more about that. And so I've kept that kind of commentary with me over time, and I was thinking that I have an article coming out about these really wonderful Chicana women who hail from Cimarron, New Mexico, who migrated to Wyoming, and they became these big Chicana activists in the city of Riverton, Wyoming, which is right near the Wind River Reservation. And their story is really incredible because they petitioned the city to pave their streets. They were the only neighborhood in the city of Riverton without paved streets, without gutters, without all this stuff. And it became very clear to them in the 70s and 80s why that was the case. The neighborhood that they lived in was an enclave of New Mexican residents. And so they pulled their efforts together, and they wrote a number of community block grants to try to get federal funding to be able to do it, and nothing came through. The city didn't support them. And so they said, well, shoot, we'll just do it ourselves. And they rallied the community, and everybody, the men quit their jobs, and the women said, well, shoot, we don't know how to do construction, but what can we do? And so they cooked, and they organized, and they videotaped everything. They're wonderful community documentarians and archivists for doing this work. And they had a mantra, they had theme songs. They said, we get by with a little help from our friends, which everyone will know. And what was interesting about their efforts is that at the end of the day, the city said, well, this is what happens when community does for themselves. But the interesting part about it is I was trying to think about this comment from Christine Marin about those New Mexican women, and I thought, is there a particular work ethic that is associated with people from northern New Mexico? And I thought, absolutely yes. And Rodolfo Anaya, who is not a woman, obviously, but he has a phrase called apura pala, which means that you get by with hard work, right? And a pala is a shovel, but really this is kind of, he calls it a New Mexican mantra or a work ethic. And so I thought it was really incredible to think about these women within a frame of a work ethic associated with the experience of being from New Mexico. And we know right now, we're coming up on the 175th anniversary of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War in 1848 on February 2nd. And you mentioned early on the question about lost territory, in conjunction with the way that we've experienced land loss in New Mexico. And so I'm really intrigued by the ways that all these women writers in New Mexico have taken up the topic of land loss and how they've written themselves back into the record, even though they have this deep sentiment of loss connected to colonization, connected to the loss of treaty rights, et cetera. And so I'm wondering from a historical perspective, and even in your book, A Land Apart, how did you look at that when you were thinking about how kind of Southwesterners and maybe even women in particular were experiencing their belonging?
So I'm a historian who believes that if women are there, you pay attention to them. That said, I wanted to center women in the story of the Manhattan Project because I feel like that's most frequently told as a man's story. So I quite consciously wrote the chapter in that book with the intention of centering women's experiences. And I start with the home of Edith Warner at the foot of the hill and the tea house that she ran where many Los Alamos scientists performed their work. But I also really wanted to give attention to the Pueblo women who were cleaning the houses and looking after the children of the white families predominantly who were in Los Alamos. And their work was so important that at one point, the women who were employing them in Los Alamos wrote out a contract that said, you know, they get this time off for feast days, they get this time off for their own family's obligations, which undoubtedly came from the pressure of the Pueblo women themselves. So I don't know the names of the Pueblo women themselves, but you don't need a contract like that unless someone is abusing your labor, right? So either the white women who were employing them figured out that they were going to lose their employees because some of them were abusing their employees, or Pueblo women's pressure led to that contract. So that's one woman's story that I center in that particular chapter.
Oh, it's fascinating. There is a new book by Mariah Gomez, who is from Rancho, New Mexico, called Nuclear Nuevo Mexico, and it takes on this topic of the nuclear colonization of New Mexico brought on by the onset of the Manhattan Project. And in that, she does a series of oral history interviews with Pueblo women and Hispanic women who were displaced from the Pajarito Plateau, where the Manhattan Project was located. And so if you are interested, it just came out last year, so it's a fascinating read. And Mariah is very invested in environmental justice in the state of New Mexico, and she's a current professor at the University of New Mexico. So check out her book. It's really great.
And Mariah and Tracy Bryn Voiles and a variety of scholars have brought attention to the fact that it is particularly women's bodies that bear the brunt of radiation. So it is a women's issue. Nuclear contamination is definitely a women's issue.
Yeah, and speaking of bearing the brunt, I also want to uplift Bernadine Hernandez, who is another professor also at the University of New Mexico. Her book, Border Bodies, just came out. And her book goes back to the 19th century, and it talks about the way that sex was used as reproductive capital for women, and how women were a part of the sexual economy in New Mexico by producing labor. So through their labor as in work, but also through their labor as in reproduction. And so it's really interesting because it reminds me also of Paula Gunn Allen, who's a native writer from New Mexico. She's from Western New Mexico, as is Leslie Marmon Silko. But Paula Gunn Allen has a great essay called The Red Roots of White Feminism. And in that essay, she says that if the men are not listening to the women about sending their children to war, they will stop producing warriors. And I think it's such a powerful thing because we don't realize the amount of power that women yield in being able to control these kind of decisions, right? And some of the things that Flannery and I were talking about while we were preparing this presentation was, what are the characteristics of these New Mexican women that we are upholding? Because on one hand, even women after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo were able to maintain property rights in ways that other women were not. Hispanic women could inherit property. Indigenous women had no rights after the treaty. And so we're also thinking about what are the kind of aspects that women upheld characteristically or just communally that helped them to navigate, the past, present, and then into their future.
Yeah, and I know when we were preparing, we talked a bit about, on the one hand, our desire to lift up particular women in history, in particular women in contemporary culture. On the other hand, our desire to celebrate groups of women. And then our concern that if we emphasized just groups of women, that would reinforce the perception of women as humble, patient, strong. Mm-hmm. And were these characteristics innate to women, or were these characteristics that women took on by virtue of the prejudices that conscribed their lives?
Yeah, and we didn't come to a decision on the question. And so, and I think even if we think about our own families, how our mothers, our sisters, our daughters have navigated their lives, right? What kind of characteristics have they developed to respond to a very male-dominated society, to respond to, in Cleofas Jaramillo, or in her case, for example, if y'all have not read Cleofas Jaramillo, she was a writer in the 50s. She started the Sociedad Folclórica de Santa Fe, so she's very well known in this area. But what was interesting about her story is that she very much existed in the shadow of her husband, Wenceslao Jaramillo, who held all these very high positions within New Mexico, the territory. But when her husband died, she explains in her book, Romance of a Little Village Girl, that she felt like this life came into her and she had to take on this other persona because her husband was no longer there. She had to manage the affairs of the family. She had to take care of her daughter. She went through a number of miscarriages. Her daughter actually tragically died when she was murdered in Santa Fe. That's part of a bigger story. But what she does in this book is she does the very typical white glove kind of stays clean about things, doesn't tell everybody all the secrets. You can read between the lines, but there's also the archival evidence to show what actually happened. And so people would know the story about her daughter that she does not divulge in her book. And so she does exhibit to be a very strong woman, but she's also very humble about what she shares and what she knows. And so I think it's very interesting how she kind of navigates both of those within her work.
Well, and I was struck by the research that I did for this presentation regarding Genoveva Chavez. So I didn't know that Genoveva Chavez was gay. And I was reading I was reading a draft of the book Wide Open Desert, which is coming out any day now. It's by Jordan Biro Walters. And Jordan Biro Walters discusses Genoveva Chavez and her decision to move to Los Angeles so that she could be in a wide open town. And her long-term partner, Dorothy Rivera, was named in only one obituary for Genoveva Chavez. And on the one hand, that is Rivera being humble, being patient. On the other hand, that is the strength that sustained their relationship at a time when Santa Fe society would not have widely tolerated it. So there are times when humility, patience, these attributes that are instilled in girls and in women can come in pretty handy for things that a lot of people might not consider womanly.
Absolutely. I like to think that New Mexican women just play the long game. So that we're smart enough to know, we strategize appropriately to play a long game because we know that that's necessary, right? So I don't find, I have a lot of colleagues, many of whom are part of the slideshow, that we often strategize and we say, when we're actually coming into, we're part of a new generation of scholars and we're thinking about what is the kind of mark that we're going to be making and what kind of long-term arguments do we want to hold still for many years to come. As a scholar, I write critically about Cleofas Jaramillo because I also recognize the disparaging ways that she talked about indigenous peoples within her work, and that's not okay with me as a scholar today. And so I also want to both recognize that if she would not have written, then we would not have had access to this kind of literature, but also we have to think differently about those contributions over time. And so I think that's really important as well. And so I want to just kind of end our conversation before Q&A with, we talked about, as women from New Mexico, we feel a certain responsibility, right? And we started the conversation with the people who have lifted us up. I would not have gone to grad school had it not been for Maria Dolores Gonzalez and Tediana Rebolledo, who told me it was possible, that I was smart enough, that I could do it, who also told me I have to work twice as hard because that's how Chicanas have to work. And so I took all of that, but very grateful for those women who uplifted me during that time. And of course, my mom, who was like, everything's gonna be okay, Hita. And I'm like, okay. But now, now that you're at this kind of stage in your career, like, what is your thoughts about the kind of responsibility you carry as a New Mexican woman from a particular legacy and then moving forward?
I feel some of the same responsibility that you were just describing vis-a-vis Jaramillo. My nieces recently moved to Santa Fe. My elder niece is in 4th grade, and her teacher dedicated the day after MLK Day to a wider discussion, not just the Black Civil Rights Movement, but a wider discussion of social justice movements. And she decided that she wants to write a book about child slavery, which is very characteristic of our family. Like, of course, we will write a book. I'm 9 years old. Why not? So she was asking me, how do you write a book? And I actually, her questions were so rapid fire that I was just like, well, this is where the illustrator comes from, and here's how you decide on the cover. And we had been talking for 30 minutes when I realized I have a chapter about Nina Otero-Warren in my book, and she goes to Nina Otero Elementary School. So, and there's a picture of her, and it's a different picture than the one we used. So I open up the book, and I show it to her, and I say, tell me what the title of this book chapter is. And she said, Nina Otero-Warren's Place. And like her eyes got big.
She's like, wait a minute.
Yeah, and she asked if she could bring the book to school to show to her teacher. And Nina Otero-Warren was also very disparaging of indigenous people. So at what point do I share that with my niece? And that's part of my educational responsibility, I think. I also, though, increasingly see it as my job to get out of the way. Like, there are such great young scholars coming up, and I feel like it's my job to clear the path, give them a chance to share their great work, and put the spotlight on them.
Absolutely, yeah. And there are so many, it's very interesting how many people reach out to you just because they know you're New Mexican. And so I just got to reach out. There's a law student at the University of Georgia who said, hey, I saw you online and I'm coming back to New Mexico and I just want to talk about all your work. And I thought that was really interesting because you get these really like random reach outs, but it's New Mexico that does this, And so I always think, I feel similar to you that we have to move out of the way. There are lovely new scholars who are being trained differently and who have new perspectives. A lot of my book on colonial legacies is that there are these different pieces that we understand at different points in time, and we're always learning new things. And as we learn those new things, we should rethink the way that we thought about other things. And that's very general, but I think it is important for us to always move forward the way that we're thinking. It's not our intention to remain kind of stifled in the scholarship. And sometimes, I write about things and I say, oh, I shouldn't have done that. I should write about it differently. And so I think even questioning what we do, I think is important over time. But, I think that I still uphold the idea of we rise together. That's one of the mantras that I hold all the time. And I think that's because we're very community minded, and I think it's important that we reject those kind of individualistic ideas, and we're here for each other because that's how we got here, and that's how we're going to keep going.
And we probably should pause for questions.
Yes,
So
yes.
I have a great story that I think is just like such a New Mexico story. So my dad lives next to Camila Bustamante and Demetria Martinez, and they came over to watch football one night because Camila's a huge Patriots fan. And Demetria walked in, and I hadn't met her yet, and I said, Demetria Martinez, that name is familiar. And then I said, you're in my book. And I grabbed my copy of A Land Apart off my dad's shelf, and I looked in the index so that I could find what page she was on. And I showed her, you're in my book. And she said later, how did you know about me and my work? She's a writer, she's an immigrant rights activist. She said, how did you know about me and my work? And I said, Amy Villarreal writes about you in her dissertation. And they both said, Amy. And Camila was Amy's volleyball coach, which I learned when I saw Amy at the Western History Association in San Antonio. And it felt like the most New Mexican thing ever, that I was connected to all of these powerful and influential women. And I found out when we were watching football.
So awesome. Now I feel like we need to go into story. I do have a brief story. I was volunteering with my mother at the Roadrunner Food Bank, and we were delivering to some elderly apartment complex, and we were getting there early, and we had organized all the food. And there were lots of other women of my mom's age that were there. And then my mom's talking to this other woman, and she goes, oh, did you know that my hita was a professor? And the woman goes, my daughter's a professor too. And she goes, oh, is she? And I said, what is your daughter's name? And she said, Delilah Montoya. And I was like, oh my goodness, Delilah Montoya. She's a really great photographer, just fantastic, from New Mexico. But I thought it was fun because my mom was she was like, my daughter's a professor. And then the other woman was like, so is mine. And so, but we were just there randomly, distributing food. And, we had two mothers very proud of their daughters at that moment. So I thought it was really endearing. And we'll end, yes.
Questions?
Yes, we'll move.
Let me just say thank you. I thought my daughter and I were the only two Patriots fans in New Mexico. So,
That's true.
we were not popular in that Super Bowl. Anyway, time for questions. Come on. Yes. Sorry if I don't know your name, I'm just going to point.
So my name is Chris. It's actually not a question. I work with the New Mexico Historic Women Markers Project. So I know all 135 of the women who are on markers right now. And I actually have printouts right now of the list of them and the maps if anyone's interested. So it's really my job to promote it. So I just want to say thank you for your work. And a lot of those pictures up there are very familiar. So
Thank you for your work.
Yes.
Yes.
it's exciting. It's very exciting. Thank you.
Over here.
I'm sorry, yeah.
I didn't quite hear the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. She was saying that she works for the New Mexico Historic Markers Project for Women. And so if anybody wants more information, to please let her know. Yes, she's here to promote that, the project, and was excited to see some of the markers on the screen.
Well, that leads to my next question is there a list, a reference list or something? You mentioned a lot of books that sound fascinating, but, and the name were, which I got, but where would you find?
I think you're putting us to task right now. So she's asking if there is a list of the books that we've mentioned on New Mexican women. I think that sounds like a future project, which we absolutely can do and make available. I actually won a library collection contest at Arizona State when I was a graduate student because I had a vast collection of New Mexican literature. So I got like $1,000 prize. It was very exciting. But I was like, how awesome is it that I pulled my books together and, exhibit? So yes, we can pull this together. Absolutely.
Yeah, Mary Madigan just said we're going to prepare a list and email it to everybody.
Yay, thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
Others? Give a shout out if I can't see. It's kind of on the lights in my eyes. Oh, come on. This is a Santa Fe audience. There got to be more questions. Yes, ma'am. Sir, sorry. No, okay.
So just as a follow-up, sort of what else is going on is out at El Rancho de los Golondrinas, the Living History Museum here in Santa Fe. They now have a women's tour. And it's mostly about everyday life, but it's like how they fit into the history in the 17 and 1800s here in New Mexico. And I think it's one of a kind around.
Yeah, if you've not been to Rancho de las Golondrinas, please go for the women's tour. I think one of the most interesting things is there is not a lot uncovered about 1700s and 1800s women. Diana Rebolledo, who edited the book Infinite Division, starts with an accounting of what happened to the women starting from the colonial period to the present, because there was a lot of Chicano scholars in the 1990s who came up with these periodizations of Chicano literature, and they surprisingly didn't talk about any women. And so Diana, in the very same year, was like, just so you know, here's all the women. And it's a wonderful book, and it's an anthology of Chicana writers, which include a lot of New Mexicans.
And I'm realizing a mistake I made, which is that I never gave the author of that El Palacio article who wrote about Maria Rosa Villalpando. The author is Fran Levine, the former director of the New Mexico History Museum. And she has a book that she's working on, Women of the Santa Fe Trail. It's not out yet, so it won't be on the list. But once it is out, we can put it out on the list. In any case, I wanted to honor Fran's work.
Okay. Fran did a lecture for a webinar for us, which you'll find on our YouTube site. It's open to the public. It's a great talk. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I'm going to put you to task a little bit. So this is a very sort of academic context, right? You're both professors. And a lot of the books that you're referencing are what many of us would consider in-depth academic works, which not all of us will have access to, or the time and capacity or desire to read. So if perhaps to help me simplify it, or my daughter's here, and maybe let's how do we approach this shared history, or history that we want to understand better, or the present, for those of us who, or those who don't want quite that kind of reading list?
Yes, I think it's a great question, and I will just say that I was not always an academic, and my entry into it was through literature. I'm a literature scholar, and so I was always so enthralled by the stories that people were writing. So Cleophas Jaramillo was not an academic either. She was a person who wanted to preserve the history in New Mexico, and she wrote many books. Many were cookbooks, which I think is really great. I tried to get my students to replicate 1950s recipes, and it was super fun in the state of Wyoming. But for me, it was always literature. Reading, for me, it's stories. I also am an oral historian, so I like to meet with people who want to share their stories with me, and I think that's always a good way to learn more. There's a lot of YA literature, so young adult literature. Mary Louise Sanchez has a great book about a family who moved from New Mexico to Wyoming, and how this young girl learned about her history, and even told her teacher in Wyoming that New Mexico did participate in the Civil War, and that they did so. It's all this, so I learned a lot about history and culture through that. I also learned quite a bit about women's stories through, I participate in a pilgrimage with the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. I don't know if anyone in the room is a Guadalupana, but shout out to you. Yes. So is that Jennifer? Oh, hi. I'm so excited to see you. She was on a route I led many years ago. But these women have lovely stories. And so we walk 100 miles in the first week of June, and all community members come out. They're mostly women who are feeding us, and we get a chance during those routes to be able to walk with women and hear their stories, and they're so incredible. And it's not academic at all, and it's great.
I think Sabrina and Karina is a very accessible book, and I assigned it to a class of freshmen this past spring semester, and it was the favorite text of those students. So I would definitely recommend Sabrina and Karina. But I'd also say Santa Fe in particular is so rich in museum resources and visual culture resources. So go to Rancho de las Golondrinas, come to the museum here, go to the museums on the hill. The La Malinche exhibition that was at the Albuquerque Museum, it's now I think in San Antonio. It blew me away. So there are plenty of ways of engaging a wide variety of audiences right here in Santa Fe. Go to SAR and tour the vaults.
Yay!
or grounded in clay at Mayak until it moves east. Another question or two? I see a hand up in the very back.
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to share. We come from a very small town in northern New Mexico, and they have a program in the elementary schools where the children, when they're in 5th grade, pick a person from their community, and they interview them throughout the year about their life. And they write a story about their life, and then they put on a play about their life. And the things that you learn, through that type of communication are just unbelievably invaluable. So, if there could be, programs like that in Santa Fe, or, it teaches the children, what their elders have been through, and then it makes the elders, they can share their story. It's a wonderful thing.
I think that's a fantastic idea. That's what prompted my love for oral histories, because I think what's incredible, and especially with the women in Wyoming that I interviewed, is that once I wrote an article about them and I shared it with them, I got their feedback, and then they said, we never knew our lives were incredible until somebody else said they were. And so, they're and it's so funny now because they'll message me and they'll say, we're still committed to La Causa, let us know what we can do. And I think it's really invigorated their spirit as well for someone to say, your story matters. And that happens all the time with us. And it's so fun.
Maybe one more. Any venturesome individual here?
If no one else does, I have a question.
Go for it.
So, you've offered us so many interesting perspectives on the history of women in New Mexico, the stories that are familiar to us, but also so many different angles on stories that we haven't heard. Is it even possible at this point to say what it is to be a woman in New Mexico in the 21st century? Is it just way too early since it's only 2023? I mean, it's a different world, but is it it's not like other states necessarily?
I do think that sense of responsibility is still very much being instilled in girls and women. That sense of responsibility for the wider community, that sense of responsibility for the next generation, that sense of responsibility for the well-being of the land. So I live in St. Louis now, so I can't say 100%. And sometimes it's heavy, that responsibility. A lot rests on women's shoulders. But I guess I would say I still think that women in New Mexico hold themselves responsible for the well-being of their community, including, the more than human world.
Yeah. To that, I would say that I think that when we say New Mexican women, we're not thinking about race and sexual orientation, and I think all of that changes the dynamics quite a bit. How, Black women in New Mexico experience being New Mexican versus, queer folks in New Mexico who experience being New Mexican. Those are all very different. Generationally, we experience it differently, which is why I think it's important to have young folks involved in knowing what their elders have been through, because that historical perspective is always very much alive in New Mexico. New Mexico prides itself in, having been here for many, many years. My grandmother's first cousin, Pauline Chavez-Bent, writes about the first Thanksgiving happened here before it ever happened in the East Coast. So there's a sense of pride that we have a history deeper than the founding of the United States. And that's important for folks. It's important to recognize that both New Mexico and Arizona are home to the largest number of indigenous nations that are presently still tribally recognized in the United States. That itself holds a particular history as well. And so I think people are very historically oriented. Women are, I heard from Maria Dolores Gonzalez, my mentor, that women are the bearers of culture and the carriers of culture. And so I often think about that when I flipped out one year when my mom said we were going to buy tamales, and I was like, no. And I had just read Josefina Lopez's Las Nuevas Tamaleras, which is about 3 generations of tamale makers, and I I must have stood on a little pedestal of my own creation and talked about why it was so important that we keep doing this. And that year I made them by myself in my mom's kitchen, talking to her on the phone because I had no idea how to make them, but I thought it was very important.
Well, on that note, why don't you join me in thanking our great speakers?